Thank you, Vice Chancellor. I'm Timothy Minchin, Professor of North American History, and I'm pleased to welcome you here. As the Vice Chancellor explained, the Bailyn Lecture was established in 1995 to recognize La Trobe's established expertise in North American studies. And since then, we've been fortunate to bring a range of prominent speakers here to La Trobe. And we're delighted that this year's lecture continues this tradition. It will be delivered by Alan McPherson, who is the Freeney Professor of History and the Director of the Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy at Temple University in Philadelphia. Professor McPherson is a leading historian of American foreign policy, attained his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2001. And prior to his current position, he taught at Howard University in Washington, D.C. from 2001 to 2008, and at the University of Oklahoma from 2008 to 2017. Professor McPherson has held fellowships at Harvard University and twice been a Fulbright Fellow to both the Dominican Republic and to Argentina. And he's the prize-winning author of 12 books and dozens of articles and chapters, mostly on US-Latin American relations. Among these works are Yankee No, Anti-Americanism in US-Latin American Relations with Harvard University Press, The Invaded, How Latin Americans and Their Allies Fought and Ended US Occupations with Oxford, and Ghosts of Sheridan Circle, How a Washington Assassination Brought Pinochet's Terror State to Justice. And that one's with the University of North Carolina Press. And his new book is called The Breach, Iran-Contra and the Assault on American Democracy, also with the University of North Carolina Press, and there are a few copies here if anyone is interested in looking at it further or buying a copy. Alan will talk to us today from this new research on the topic, the Omen, Iran-Contra and Trump's assault on American democracy. And as Theo was saying, it's a topic that's highly relevant as it looks at the long-term roots of Trumpism and helps us to understand it. For many people, times are confronting now, particularly in the US, but I think it's crucial, both as students of the US and as engaged citizens, that we try and understand this. I think the past can help us to do that. In particular, this topic helps us understand that Trumpism is not new, but reflects a longer-term domestic and particularly foreign policy history. I'd like to thank La Trobe University for its support of this lecture, particularly the Vice Chancellor's Office, the School of Humanities and Social Science, and the head of the Department of Archaeology and History, Dr. Emmett Robertson. Thanks also to Judy Hughes for her work in publicizing the lecture, and to my colleague and friend, Brendan O'Connor, who assisted in bringing Alan to Australia. Thank you for attending, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of Alan's talk. Please be aware that the lecture is being recorded, and hopefully a full recording will be posted on YouTube in due course. Now, the recent Bailyn lectures have been online, which has its benefits, or fully online, but it's wonderful to have an in-person event this time. As Theo was saying, Alan has just arrived in Australia early this week, and he's going to tell us about the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s and the roots of Trumpism. Thank you, Professor Alan McPherson.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that generous and thoughtful introduction. Thank you very much to the Vice Chancellor. I also want to thank Judy Hughes. She and I have done a lot of emailing back and forth for her to sort of publicize this. And so I appreciate all the hard work. I appreciate the invitation. It's been a pleasure, even though it's been kind of a whirlwind visit to Australia. I'm really glad to share this research with you. I do have a new book that essentially covers the entirety of the Iran-Contra scandal. It's a relatively short book if you're interested in getting sort of a one-book study of it. When I was in touch with Tim, he said, is there some way we can sort of link this a little bit more explicitly to the Trump era? And so I chose the title, The Omen, just to sort of as a general meaning of the word, to say this portends something bad in the future. But then I remembered that it's a series of horror movies. I don't know if you've ever seen them, in which the Antichrist comes to Earth in the form of a 5-year-old boy. And if you recall, the third one in the series, Damien the Antichrist, is now a full-grown man, played by the Kiwi actor Sam Neill. And the Antichrist is now the President of the United States. Sometimes you can be a little bit too much on the nose with your references. So that's probably why Trump is in the title. I will be happy to take questions and have a conversation afterwards. And I've got some images I want to show you. In the past few years, observers of American politics have been understandably racked with anxiety about the state of democracy in America. They've mostly feared for the future, right? Wondering if we Americans are headed towards fascism or another form of authoritarianism. Others, of course, have asked about the past. How did we get to this place of unique peril for our democratic norms and institutions? A few have ascribed much of the assault on democracy to Donald Trump, and he certainly has done more than anyone to grab American democracy by the you-know-what. Others have faulted the Republican Party as a whole for enabling Trump. So there's all sorts of ways of looking at the past, I'd say all the way back to the 1960s to sort of explain Trump. But one episode that has received comparatively little attention is the Iran-Contra scandal of the Reagan administration. That's why I thought it was important to talk about it. Now, I understand that most people might have heard of the scandal and might not quite understand it, so let me give you a brief background on it. It essentially consisted of two separate scandals that were linked. The first one was in Iran. They essentially happened at the same time, where the United States, the Reagan government wants to free American hostages that are held by allies of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is very anti-American, revolutionary, but is also at war with Iraq. And so it wants missiles. So it buys these missiles from the United States. And as you see, a few hostages are freed, although others are taken. And that's one scandal because it's secretive. It goes against American, public policy. And it's also highly illegal. But the president makes all the decisions here, right? At the same time, there's something happening in Nicaragua. If you have any sense of its history, it's taken over by a socialist guerrilla movement in 1979. So it's also revolutionary, also anti-American. And Reagan funds a guerrilla group called the Contras, right? These counter-revolutionaries that are trying to take down the government in Managua. And partly what happens is that the Congress of the United States in 1984 outlaws the sending of any funding or the help of any kind to the military efforts of the country, these counter guerrillas, right? So basically says you can't fund the Contras. They're called the Contras. And yet, Reagan tells his staff, you need to keep the Contras alive, body and soul. So they get third countries to fund them, they get private Americans to fund them, and so on. Also illegal, also secretive. These are linked because of essentially one man, right? The cover of my book has Oliver North on it. He works at the National Security Council, and he's essentially managing both of these efforts. But at one point realizes we've actually made a profit that we didn't think we were going to make on the missiles sold to Iran. So let's take that money and give it to the Contras. Okay, so that's when it becomes essentially a diversion of profits from one to the other. And it links Iran and the Contras in terms of Iran-Contra. My argument in the book is that this whole scheme and then the response to the uncovering of the scheme highlights 6 democratic norms that are assaulted during the mid-1980s, right? I'm not going to read all of these, but they're all here. In fact, I'm going to go through them one by one instead of doing that. But just to give you a sense, and I'm going to assume that we all agree that these are, in fact, norms of democracy, and they are all important. So I'm not going to make the case for why they're important. In fact, they're all in this book here. The first of these norms is the separation of powers, right? Between the legislative, the executive, and judiciary. I like this image because it tells us how the Reagan administration thought about Congress. that Congress, in fact, to them was a secondary and inferior rather than co-equal partner in government. And so it was obvious to all that the executive national security leaders, especially at the CIA and the National Security Council, acknowledged barely any of Congress's constitutional or statutory roles in funding and overseeing foreign policy. Most frustrating to the White House was the passing of the Bailyn Amendment, which prohibited funding the Contra rebels. So this is the law I was talking about in 1984, the Bailyn Amendment. In response, Reagan ordered his subordinates to keep the Contras alive, body and soul. Before Bailyn, the CIA had already illegally mined the harbors of Nicaragua, setting off a confrontation with Congress. The man who confronted Congress most openly was Bill Casey, the CIA director. The CIA was directly funding the Contras before the Bailyn Amendment. And he essentially had a habit of dissembling about all sorts of things that the CIA did, including mining the harbors of Nicaragua, which is an act of war. When questioned by members of Congress, Casey called these members fuckers, right? The ones who would not keep a secret. And so he figured they need to be kept in the dark because they can't keep a secret, right? Even those whom he was constitutionally mandated to inform. So the Constitution and several statutes says that the CIA must give prior information to the Congress about all sorts of things that it does. Distrust of Congress was rife throughout the CIA. Claire George, who was the chief of the Latin American division at CIA, also had, quote unquote, a mindset the same as Casey's. Suspicious, minimal notification, recalled an aide. That's fine that a station overseas, but it doesn't work in a democratic forum. According to Casey's deputy, the attitude of Claire Casey and others at CIA was screw the hill. Don't tell Congress anything unless you're driven to the wall. One senator assessed that on a 0 to 10 scale, Casey rated a 2 on the trust factor. A joke went around the House Intelligence Committee. If your coat was on fire, Casey would not tell you it was on fire unless you asked, is my coat on fire? Right? He would only answer questions where you essentially already knew the information. Over at the National Security Council, the main advisor, John Poindexter, specifically grew to resent Congress over its leaks, which he considered bad faith on the part of congressional opponents of Contra aid. There certainly were leaks coming out of Congress, but studies showed almost as many coming from the White House itself. And if you think of it, a lot fewer people work for the White House than work for the Congress, right? And if they're leaking the same number of leaks, it means more leaks per person. Poindexter nevertheless considered congressional inquiries as outside interference, right? To him, the process of foreign policy was entirely in the White House, and any questions coming from outside the White House was outside interference, even though, again, constitutionally mandated. Oliver North, an NSC aide to Poindexter, right? So he worked for Poindexter, later admitted that he drafted, quote unquote, misleading letters to Congress with Poindexter's predecessor, Bud McFarlane, and altered documents on his role with the Contra. He was deeply involved in moving military supplies to Central America. And he said, I didn't want to show Congress a single word on this whole thing. Once the scandal erupted, some Republicans on Congress's investigative committees proved willing to defend the most egregious Iran-Contra activities, even at the expense of their own institution. This is an important theme. It's not just that the White House wanted to keep Congress at bay. This became highly partisan to where Republicans in Congress were basically saying, oh, no, we should leave the White House alone to conduct foreign policy completely. They should lie to us. They should keep things away from us. And only Republicans were saying that, and almost all Republicans were saying that. The second norm to be eroded during Iran-Contra is the consent of the governed, threatened by the use of private corporations or mercenaries to execute foreign policy. As privatization tends to do, the Iran and the Contra varieties led not only to profiteering, but also to private actors wanting to direct foreign public policy. 1 month after Congress imposed the first limits on Contra spending, privatizing that spending also began. McPherson, the predecessor of Poindexter, he thought that Boland actually covered the NSC, right? And he stressed to staffers, quote unquote, not to solicit, encourage, coerce, or otherwise broker financial contributions to the Contras. So he said, I agree with Congress. We, the National Security Council, should not be funding the Contras. North once requested of McPherson, quote, that you approve my approaching a private donor for the provision of a replacement civilian helicopter. McPherson wrote by hand on the memo, I don't think this is legal, right? We shouldn't be giving civilian money to the Contras because the Congress told us we can't do this. For years, however, North and others would help in privatizing the war with the likes of this man, Richard Secord, who made millions in a few years. Following Reagan's orders, North and his crew coordinated most of the funds that came in and relied on non-governmental individuals who solicited donations. Many gave to the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty, run by this man here, Spitz Channel. Officially, this was a tax-exempt, nonprofit educational foundation. But in reality, what it did was take in all sorts of private money and weapons and sent it to the Contras, right? It was waging a war through something that taxpayers were paying for. And this is how they did it. One senator recalled that the technique was called the 1-2 punch. So I'll show you a picture of somebody who did this, but if you are a large donor, Oliver North would invite you to Washington, fly you in, take you from a limousine to just across the street from the White House in the Hay Adams Hotel. He'd sit you down to a nice lunch, and then he'd give you a literal menu of all sorts of items that you could purchase for the Contras, because people knew why they were being called to the White House. And they'd say, and so Oliver North would say, these are all the things that the Contras need. Helicopter, plane, machine guns, sometimes it'd be boots or medication or something like that. There were millions of dollars, right? And you could choose whatever you wanted to give. And he'd say, this is their need, but I'm not asking you to buy any of this. I'm just telling you how dangerous communism is to Central America, and this is what could help against communism. And he would get up and walk out and go back to the White House where he worked. And then Spitz Channel was just sitting right next to them. And he'd say, well, I don't work for the US government. I work for a nonprofit education organization, so I can ask you to buy these things. That was the 1-2 punch. And then you knew, obviously, I'm buying these things for Reagan's war, but Reagan's not asking for the money. Although Oliver North would essentially invite them to Washington on government letterhead, and then he would thank them for their donation on government letterhead. Right? So everybody who gave knew they were giving to the US government, right? But legally speaking, they weren't. This is one such person, Ellen Garwood. She was the widow of a very, very rich Texas oil man. And here she was, talking to the Congress about what she did. She gave over $2.5 million to the Contras. So in a typical pitch, they invited her to the Hay Adams. And they gave her, she recalled that the sort of menu options that she was shown included bullets, cartridge belts, possibly surface-to-air missiles. And there were quantities opposite each category. And after that, there was a sum of money that was needed. But then North got up, left, and she purchased a $65,000 helicopter that was christened the Lady Ellen. She said she had no doubt, these are her words, no doubt, she said in a deposition, that this was the executive department of the government that was asking for this help. And it was because Oliver North was sitting at the table with her that she thought this, right? She didn't actually think she was giving this to a private organization. One of the problems with this privatization was the secret profiteering. Obviously, governments can use private corporations, and those private corporations always make a profit. But in the typical non-secretive way, there's an open bidding, and then there's an attention paid to profits, right? And there's transparency. When it's a secret war, you can keep everything secret, and therefore you can make a lot more money off the government and off the taxpayers than you normally would. But North and others in government assumed that their private partners would take either no profit or just a small one. But it was pretty typical that profits would run from 30% to 200%. Secord, that I showed, the pictures I showed you, sold about $11 million in arms and other equipment to the Contras and drove around in a Porsche. He made $3 million in direct personal benefits from the Iran-Contra scandal. The NEPL, right, Spitz Channels Organization, at some point they took in $12 million. 6.3 million of those was intended to the Contras, but only about 3.3 million reached them. Channels and his colleagues kept the rest for expenses and salaries, including lobbying, political action committees, and TV ads for Republicans running against anti-Contra Democrats, and sometimes just for other Republicans who had nothing to do with running against anti-Contra Democrats. So the Contra War, in other words, became a way to further other conservative causes, serve Republican campaigns, and pad bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Contra leader Adolfo Calero testified that Secord, when selling him weapons, said nothing about a markup, leading Calero to understand that he was obtaining his arms at cost. Maybe a little naive, you might think, but still some clarity would have been nice. Neither North nor his superiors ever asked the arms dealers about markups. Had these private businesses contracted through the normal channels of the US government, they would have been first, a competitive process, and second, more attention paid to profits. One retired CIA employee complained that arms dealers were, quote, ripping off the Contras, buying shoddy stuff and selling it for high prices. For example, they purchased hand grenades for $3 each and sold them to the Contras for $9. And the aircraft that Secord bought with private funds, right, the Lady Ellen and so on, they were old, poorly maintained, and cursed with broken parts. Some could not even fly. They're a piece of shit, said the CIA man. Some Contra leaders also profited handsomely from private aid. As journalists reported, millions had gone straight into the hands of Calero. So he complained about too many profits, but he kept plenty of money for himself. In fact, he kept $1 million of one delivery of 3.3 million received by the Contras. Right? And these Contras, they are poor, they're peasants, right? They're guys who are living in the countryside, in the jungles of Honduras or Costa Rica, just waiting for some things to get to them, right? Medication, food, boots, and so on. Meanwhile, Calero and men like these, they're living in their mansions in Miami and raking in millions of dollars. Privatization also led to demands on policy. Typical when philanthropists are involved, right? If you all work at a university, when philanthropists give money to the university, they will usually want to say how that university is run. Same thing happens with a private war. Reagan felt obligated, for instance, to write to Lady Ellen Garwood to thank her for her support. Her response to him was to demand that Jeane Kirkpatrick, at the time the ambassador to the United Nations, replace the Secretary of State. So she said, now that I've given you millions of dollars, I want to decide who's going to be Secretary of State. And I want this lady rather than the guy who's already there, right? She wouldn't have said that if she hadn't given millions to the president's private war. Of course, none of these people are elected or accountable to the people. As always, Reagan-era Republicans cared little for the dangers of privatization. When Representative Cheney, Dick Cheney was a representative back then, when he learned that the beer magnate Joseph Coors had donated to the Contras, he was delighted. Let me assure you, he vowed, from now on, I'll buy nothing but Coors beer. And he's on a committee investigating this wrongdoing. And he says, nothing wrong about it. A third norm of democracy under clear assault was the rule of law. Enumerating the laws broken during those years would take too long, but here's a partial list. I won't go through this list. I think you get the point that there's a lot of them. Throughout the Iran-Contra scheme, executive branch leaders wanted legal workarounds because they were told by lawyers and by all sorts of people that you're very likely breaking one of these laws. And lawyers essentially were there to provide those legal workarounds. The National Security Council's lawyers, for instance, claimed that the NSC was not, in the language of Boland, quote unquote, involved in intelligence activities, right? Boland said you can't give any money if you're involved in intelligence activities to the Contras. But common sense indicated that an organization like the NSC that analyzed, disseminated, and directed intelligence was involved in intelligence. This casuistry was all Oliver North and others at the NSC needed to help private funding and provide military advice to the Contras, which Boland also prohibited, right? Boland basically said, you can't even use your salary as a government official to help the Contras, right? North admitted advising the Contra, for instance, on which targets to attack. That is direct military advice. Illegality also resided in the diversion of US government profits from sales to Iran toward funding for the Contras. That hyphen that I told you about, right, in that Venn diagram. As Claire George of the CIA explained, this is of the CIA, right? They're doing this. He said, you do not sell US government equipment to make a profit to engage in international activities that are neither authorized nor appropriated by the US Congress. You cannot take US weapons and just go out and sell them for a profit and use the profits as you see fit. Even Henry Kissinger agreed that this was illegal. Henry Kissinger, right? Without the Congress's sole right to appropriate funds, the president, therefore, or anybody else in the executive could sell federal property and use the funds for a private endeavor. As the congressional committees warned, this is the path to dictatorship. One time, North Secretary Fawn Hall said the quiet part out loud, sometimes you have to go above the written law. And immediately members of Congress said, excuse me, what did you just say? And then she walked back her comment, but it clearly exposed the way she and her boss and everybody at the National Security Council thought, which is that if the law stands in your way, do what you want anyways, and you'll find some way around it. On to norm number 4, quid pro quo arrangements with foreign governments who use secrecy as a fulcrum to make demands on US foreign policymakers, and thus violated the citizens' right to run their own government in a democracy. Government officials were keenly aware that quid pro quos could be perilous to a high-stakes, secretive foreign policy. The CIA's top lawyer called them feasible, but only if there were no monetary promises or inducements from the United States government. When the Saudi prince Bandar bin Sultan told McPherson that he could contribute $1 million per month to the Contras, Reagan, quote, made clear to me that no one should know about it, and let's keep it that way. All right, so Reagan knew about this, and he basically told his national security advisor, don't tell anyone. McPherson hated passing the hat around to third countries. I believe strongly that we could not and should not expect to sustain the Contra policy with this kind of support. But he could feel the pressure from other Republicans. In March 1985, he met with 4 Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee. All approved of third country funding and quid pro quos, right? These are Republicans in the House Intelligence Committee. And they're saying, yeah, it's fine, get private money to run this war. Congress's lawyer, Arthur Lyman, once asked McPherson, were you uncomfortable that you might be creating some explicit quid for a quo? Yes, answered McPherson, you always have to consider what it is that you may invite by way of reciprocal gesture or concession. What obligation do you incur for having had some contribution of this kind? Yes. With the Saudis, he added, we were vulnerable to the possibility that one day a quid pro quo would be asked or urged. And remember, the Saudis know this is a secret war, right? So they can always ask something of the Americans. And if the Americans don't give it back to them, they could reveal the war. The White House, including the president, secretly raised $34 million from other countries for the Contras. Almost all of it came from the Saudis. Senior officials eventually made solicitations of some 24 governments. Here's a few examples of what they did get. In exchange for Taiwan's offer of $1 million, North promised the unlikely quid that the Contras, once in power, once they take over Nicaragua, they would recognize the Taiwanese regime, right, as independent of China. Again, he made the promise for an additional million. To Taiwan's nemesis, the People's Republic of China, meanwhile, North also promised Contra recognition, putting the prospective government in a bind. So he basically said, if China also gives $1 million, we won't recognize Taiwan as independent. But then they promised the opposite to Taiwan. To El Salvador, from which supplies flew to the Contras, Reagan promised to support trade legislation that favored Nicaragua's neighbor. Guatemala's president requested of the Secretary of State that in return for his support, the US would triple military assistance and double economic assistance. North explicitly called Guatemala's demands a quid pro quo system. They were using this word over and over again. As a quo to the United States, Guatemala falsified end user certificates. These are a little complicated, but essentially it means if you're sending military equipment to a country, that country needs to sign an end user agreement, which is them promising that they will use it. They will not pass it on to another country or a private organization. So Guatemala was signing these knowing they were false, knowing that they were essentially giving that equipment to the Contras. In February 1985, Reagan sent a formal letter to President Suazo of Honduras, offering increased aid in return for Honduras hosting Contra bases. They call these incentives rather than a quid pro quo. Brunei was the strangest story of all. They went over there and they talked to the Sultan of Brunei, who was the richest man in the world at that time. He asked for something in return, and the Americans said, no, we're not going to give you anything in return except for our gratitude. He said, well, okay, that's fine. Gave them and he promised $10 million to the Contras. And the weirdest part of this is that the number of the Swiss bank account was given to Fawn Hall, and she transposed two numbers by mistake. So the 10 million never got to the right bank account. And so some millionaire in Switzerland at some point realized he had 10 million extra dollars in his account. And then the scandal erupted. And so the money never made it to the Contras and just went back to the Sultan of Brunei. So that's $10 million that the Contras never got. And Republicans essentially looked upon all this as business as usual. The fifth thing that was essentially eroded was obstruction of justice, or at least obstruction of justice was the crime committed essentially, especially once Iran-Contra becomes a public scandal. Those caught up in it often obstructed justice, showing their disdain for the independence of the courts that is standard in a democracy. This is the Attorney General Ed Meese receiving a medal from President Trump. He was the Attorney General under Reagan, a very loyal friend of Reagan, his campaign manager and everything. And this is what happens when the Iran and Contra portions are discovered, but the link between the two has not yet been discovered. Reagan tells Meese, go to the office of Oliver North, who's clearly in the middle of all this, and he says, iron out the wrinkles. Try to find out what happened. He does not say, investigate. Because in the American criminal justice system, once you open an investigation, then any obstruction of that investigation is obstruction of justice. But if people are just asking questions, but there's no official investigation, then it's not obstruction of justice, and you can't be indicted for it. So Ed Meese essentially goes to the office of Oliver North, installs a couple of subordinates there, and they say they're gonna start looking through your paperwork. They don't close down the office. They don't tell North to stay home. He's there with his secretary, Fawn Hall, and they start feeding documents into the shredder next to these guys who are reading documents, right? And those guys will eventually, a couple of days later, find out the diversion memo that tells about money being sent to the Contras from Iran. But for 3 days, North is there shredding. Even if they tell him about the memo, he's still shredding, right? Night and day, he stays there till 4 or 5 in the morning. And they're jamming the shredder because they're putting so many documents into it. And he's shocked to hear about the diversion memo because he thinks he shredded it. right? So there's that form of obstruction of justice, which is not officially obstruction of justice, but it's done essentially by the Department of Justice. The other form is also legal, but just as dangerous, which is the refusal to produce documents in court. Once a scandal erupts, Reagan feels compelled to nominate a man called Lawrence Walsh as independent counsel, who sort of runs this independent group of lawyers whose job it is to find if there are any crimes committed in Iran-Contra. Their greatest frustration of this 6-year ordeal that goes to 1993 is that they can't get government to produce documents. And it's worse than that. Oliver North and many others have been indicted. And so they tell their lawyers, well, I was part of all of these secrets of national security. So to defend myself, we need to declassify hundreds of thousands of documents. And the government clearly is going to say, no, we're not going to declassify these documents, right? Even though you kind of need those documents to show that he's not responsible for all these policies. And so there's an impasse there. And to me, it's so clearly obstruction of justice by the government itself. And finally, perhaps the most fundamental norm in a democracy is that of trust. And without truth, there is no trust. And so truth was probably one of the greatest casualties of the Iran-Contra scandal. It severely eroded the presumption of truth among public officials and citizens. Before and after the scheme became public, officials lied to Congress and the media repeatedly. Much about the affair can be gleaned from the biography of the man at the center of the Iran component, Manucher Ghorbanifar, an arms dealer and the most mendacious private individual in this saga. Ghorbanifar was alternatively known as Manucher Ghorbanifar, Jafar Suzani, another spelling, and Manuel Pereira. These names showed up on Portuguese, Greek, Iranian, and Iraqi passports. Others knew him as Ashgari, Nicholas Kralis, Nick the Greek, or simply Radi. He was born in Isfahan, Iran in 1945, or maybe 1938, or maybe it was 1944. Nobody really knew. Sometimes his English was fluent, sometimes it was broken. Before the 1979 revolution, he was a partner in a shipping firm and may have served as an Iranian army officer, but we don't know. Casey of the CIA believed that the Iranian Jew was secretly an Israeli agent, but he may have been a double agent for Israel and Iran. This was their only partner in between the United States government and the Iranian government. The only man, right? And probably the worst liar the American government has ever dealt with. Let me give you a sense of this. In his sort of 10 years or so of dealing with the CIA, he was first given a lie detector test and he failed it. He was given a second lie detector test about a year or two later and he failed it. At that point, the CIA put out a burn notice on him, which is basically a message throughout the US government, do not deal with this man. He is a liar. Still, they kept dealing with him because they couldn't find anybody else who apparently could talk to the Iranians. In 1986, before the scandal erupts, there's a third lie detector test. They asked him 15 questions. On 13 of the 15 questions, he is deemed to be deceptive, which means we know that he's lying on 13 of these 15 questions. On the last two questions, his answers are deemed inconclusive. The two questions were, what's your name and what's your nationality? And they couldn't tell if he was telling the truth. This is after almost a decade of dealing with him, okay? So this is the kind of world that Oliver North lived in, and so he fully absorbed this. And in a sense, you can forgive some mendaciousness, right? When you're dealing with all sorts of liars, sometimes you have to lie to them to do what is right for American foreign policy. But clearly, Oliver North lied all the time himself, not just to enemies, but to allies. And then, of course, took the oath, to not lie in front of the Congress, even though he had lied to the Congress. And then after taking the oath, admitted he had lied to the Congress in previous taking of oaths. By the way, it's a crime in the United States to take an oath and lie, right? That's perjury. But it's also a crime if you talk to Congress and you haven't taken an oath. Even if you're not under oath and you lie to Congress, it's a different crime, but it's also a crime. So anyways, I'm not going to describe all of the lies, but Oliver North's testimony put front and center the debate over truth and democracy. North was, to put it plainly, a liar. He lied often, and he lied about important things. Ollie North, God, the man could speak a blue haze of bullshit, recall a CIA specialist on Latin America. At times, I was convinced that he was mad. One colleague who worked at the NSC said of North, I've concluded that not only is he a liar, but he's delusional, power hungry, and the danger to the president and the country. Despite all the obvious lying from their colleagues, Republicans spent much of the scandal blaming the media. North targeted journalists, Poison Pen Inc., as he called it, for distorting his role in Iran-Contra. He railed against quote unquote cultural elites and media jackals, right? Might as well have been the fake news. He bandied about nicknames for major news outlets, the New York Crimes, the Washington Compost, the nasty broadcasting system. Reagan himself described reporters as a circle of sharks. Democrats were aghast at Republican mendacity and its impact on democracy. And they talked about this all the time, right? How dangerous this was for democracy. Said Lee Hamilton of Indiana, Congress could not, quote, play its constitutional role if it cannot trust the testimony of representatives of the president as truthful and fully informed. Another representative from Ohio worried about the chilling scenario of officials who lied, misrepresented, and deceived. It is a prescription for anarchy in a democratic society. Bailyn himself, right, the law is named after Representative Bailyn, he concluded that trust between Congress and the intelligence agencies of the executive branch had been lost. That trust, I fear, has been one of the casualties of the Iran-Contra affair. Despite these dire warnings from Democrats about the danger to democracy, Republicans almost completely got away with Iran-Contra. On Christmas Eve 1992, outgoing President George H.W. Bush pardoned all those who, at the time, stood convicted or indicted in Iran-Contra. Conservatives did not merely forgive and forget Iran-Contra, they never understood it to begin with. While guardians of democracy cataloged serious and repeated departures from norms, two Republican White Houses and their allies in Congress and the press dismissed them as a small price to pay for a well-intentioned, if flawed, foreign policy. Machiavellian means to an end. Republicans laid bare what one of their own, Michael Ledeen, called, quote, the neoconservative distrust of democracy. The scandal, they said, consisted of mistakes in judgment and nothing more. This is from a Republican report to Congress. There was no constitutional crisis, it said. No systematic disrespect for the rule of law, no grand conspiracy, and no administration-wide dishonesty or cover-up. The Republicans' suggestions for reform were actually aimed at weakening Congress vis-a-vis the executive. Overall, they concluded, we emphatically reject the idea that through these mistakes, the executive branch subverted the law, undermined the Constitution, or threatened democracy. To those who paid attention during Trump's first impeachment hearings in 2019, much of this will sound familiar. An executive branch defying the will of Congress, disrespect for the law, disregard for the truth, evasion in the courts, the privatization of war, especially quid pro quos with foreign nations. Remember that perfect phone call? Since Trump's second election, of course, it has gotten much worse. Much of it may have been avoided if the lessons of Iran-Contra had been seriously analyzed and heeded. This look back at years of scandal should recast Iran-Contra as a major step towards a disintegration of democracy, now assaulting America with brute force. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. It's a really fascinating lecture. I mean, I'm quite a hardened historian of the post-war US, but even I'm quite shocked at how extensive this wrongdoing was. It's really quite a scandal that you document very in detailed way. And also find it extraordinary, given that the polls of Ronald Reagan. If you ask Americans the greatest presidents, he ranks very highly.
He does.
His reputation is very strong.
Yeah. Interestingly, when the scandal erupts, his polls go down in 1 month more than any other presidential poll in history to that point. But then they go right back up a few months later. By the time he's out of power, he's still very popular.
And of course, all of this is occurring in the context of the Cold War, and there's a common view, particularly among conservatives in the US, that Reagan won the Cold War. Do you think this gives him a sort of free pass for this sort of scandal to unfold?
Yes, in some ways. I mean, one thing I'm trying to do historiographically is to say we shouldn't just think of Iran-Contra as a footnote to the Cold War. Because clearly, at least one of these initiatives, the Contra one, is a Cold War initiative. And I'm not necessarily arguing that it's necessarily good or bad. I have my opinions about it, but that's not what the book is about. I'm trying to argue that we need to see this outside of outside of the Cold War as something that's got to do with a much longer disintegration of American democracy. But it is important to understand that this was the Cold War, and that is one of the major reasons that Reagan does not get impeached over this, right? The Democrats who controlled Congress, controlled both houses of Congress, could have really pushed for an impeachment, right? One mistake they made is that they bought the story that the most important crime here was the diversion of profits from Iran to the Contras, was the hyphen. And if you buy that that's the only important thing that's been done, and you can't show that Reagan knew about it, then Reagan can't be impeached, right? Even though Reagan do all these other important things. I think part of the reason that the Democrats were so willing to forgive Reagan himself is that he was also in negotiations with Gorbachev. And they thought, if we impeach this president and we have another Watergate, that's bad for the country as a whole, right? And we can't have this as we're finally in serious negotiations with the Soviet Union. And that might have made sense in the short term, if you want, right? To not have sort of another Watergate. But in the long term, it essentially forgives the president for what's a really serious scandal.
Right, we have time for some questions from the audience, and Harrison here has a microphone who can come out to you if you have a question. You want to raise your hand? Get over there.
Thank you for a very enlightening and enjoyable and terrifying lecture. Just one point about your heading in reference to Omen, because that's what I came in and had a look at. It has that interpretation of sort of a dark thing in the future. First of all, I imagine most of what you're saying relates to the present. And secondly, I wonder if you put a hyphen between the O and then left the men out there. I noticed 99% women were absent, and it was 99% men in your area. As a psychologist, I wonder about that. And I recognise that it represents probably a lack of women, unfortunately, in politics and the law. My question is, your approach to history, I just framed in my head forensic history, and I wonder if you could comment, say, internationally. I read an article, Australian history, the number of students and the faculties are on the decrease. Forensic history has illuminated a huge amount of our history in relation to Indigenous people. Is this a common theme internationally, that history in terms of students and faculties is on the wane? And if so, I hope the production of your books validates and increases that trend. In the other direction.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for the question. I mean, let me just answer part of it, which is that, yes, history is in decline as a field of study. I think we see this in terms of the majors that are choosing history. My university, many other universities. I was giving this a version of this talk at Yale University, and they said, actually, our majors have increased But they said that's because the big consulting firms want history majors, right? Because if you're a consultant, you can essentially learn anything very quickly, and that's what historians are very good at, is going through a lot of material, reading a lot, and then writing in a sort of synthetic way about what they've read. But I think the big consulting firms like McKinsey, they're not going to Temple University. They're not going to big state universities. They're just going to the Ivy Leagues. So everywhere else, people are getting the message that it simply doesn't pay, like literally does not pay, to learn history. And so that's unfortunate. There's probably some truth in it, but there's also some exaggerations in it.
Katie, thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I just want to endorse the comments about how engaging and disturbing your lecture was. I'm afraid I remember the Iran-Contra scandal, but I do not remember how it broke. Can you elaborate on that? And if it's got anything to do with the media and the press, perhaps reflect a little bit on the changes in the context now of the way in which the press is being delegitimized and disempowered. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. No, that's a good question. I talk about that a little bit in the book. First part of it is how it breaks. There's essentially two big events, right? These policies really get going in 1984, 1985, early 1986. And then in early October 1986, a plane goes down in Nicaragua. That plane had, I think, left El Salvador, was carrying weapons to the Contras. And a 14-year-old Nicaraguan Sandinista soldier saw the plane, and I think he had a rocket-propelled grenade, just launched it at the plane, got a lucky shot, and that plane started going down in flames and crashed into a mountain. Now, there were 3 men aboard that plane, and one of them was what's called a kicker. So they would have a big sort of cargo of material, and he would kick it out of the plane, right, with a parachute on it. These men were not supposed to have their own parachutes, because the theory is you're doing this secret war. If the plane goes down, we can't have any witnesses, and you're just going to die. He said, I don't care about that. And his brother lent him his parachute. So he had a parachute. So he parachutes out of this plane. The Nicaraguans find him, and he immediately says, right, when he's in front of TV cameras, I work for the CIA. I'm just some working class guy who works for the White House and the CIA, and that's why I'm here. So that exposes the Contra part of this. And the big debate is he really working for the CIA? It's not clear that he really is, but he clearly is working for the secret war. That's been reported on in sort of vague ways for a couple of years, but now there's clear evidence of it. A month later, a report comes out of a small newspaper in Beirut, Lebanon, that basically says that people like from the National Security Council are negotiating the release of hostages with the Iranians. And so that makes it into a larger paper, and then that makes it onto the front page of American newspapers. And so that exposes the Iran part of it. And that's when Reagan sort of starts feeling, okay, we need to get a handle on this. And then they go look at the documents of Oliver North, and they realize that there's been a diversion of one to the other. And Oliver North is still a very sort of secretive person. I mean, he's a low level, I mean, he's a mid-level national security official, right? He's never in front of cameras. There's one picture of him. It's kind of grainy. Nobody really knows his name. So the second part of the question is the media, and that's very interesting. So this is still a time when you have essentially the legacy media, if you want, is in charge of how Americans think about foreign policy and other things. So you've got 3 networks, you've got major newspapers, and they're the ones who collect all the facts, and everybody else sort of reflects on them. So I would say, generally speaking, Americans are pretty accurately informed about Iran-Contra, right? There aren't sort of major voices lying to them like they are today, right? Or who just aren't reporting things. I mean, this is a big story. Everybody's reporting on it. And I've got numbers about that. I can't remember exactly what they are, but for like a solid month, it's major news on nighttime, news programs. But there is an inkling of this sort of conservative media, and it's clearly a network. It's essentially led by the National Review, and it's led by the Washington Times, right, which is still today a very conservative newspaper. And as soon as something happens in the Washington Times, it immediately gets spread and all the talking points get repeated by everybody else, right? Including sometimes radio, but mostly sort of magazines and newspapers. And so there's already sort of a, and the Wall Street Journal is also very important in this, in that they're not denying facts. They're just basically saying these aren't really important, right? The story you're getting from Republicans and from Republican media is that, yes, this all happened, but it was for a good reason. It's a Machiavellian argument, right? The ends justify the means. We're fighting the Cold War. We're rescuing hostages. And so it doesn't really matter how much American democracy suffers because we're bringing democracy to the rest of the world. That's an argument. At least it's an argument and it's based on truth, right? Which is different from what you have now, which is lack of argument based on lies.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
Thanks, that's fantastic. And like Katie, I sadly remember Iran-Contra, although I was young at the time. My question follows on from Katie's and that point about lying. And I wonder whether one of the big points of difference between where we are today and where that was, that, okay, Ollie North lies. Politicians have always lied in the contemporary period. But there's a sort of order of magnitude difference about lying and the sense of shame with being caught lying that seemed to still be kind of valid at that point in time. Reagan had to be kept above the fray, that kind of thing. The sense now that were the Trump administration caught in something like this, there would be no sense of shame. The lying is of world historic proportions. The sort of lying that the administration officials undertook clearly during their confirmation process was quite something when you look back at it. And I just wonder whether I'm right in that sense that there's that shamelessness about lying has moved. And if that is the case, did this help breach, as you sort of put in the title, or is there something else at play now?
Yeah, no, that's a good and very complicated question. I say there's sort of two things that have changed that make lying more prominent in American politics. One is technology, is the fact that because of cable television, because of talk radio, and especially because of the internet, you have a multiplication of voices, right? You have so many channels, and you need to fill that air with things that you can sell the air and make money off of it. And so commentary becomes a lot more important than facts. Right? When you're doing 30 minutes a night, 5 nights a week, there's very little you can say. You just sort of communicate the facts, right? You're not full of opinion and commentary and stuff like that. And now that's largely what American media is. It's just people commenting on the very, very few facts that are actually being reported. And so that encourages partisanship, it encourages conflict, and it encourages lying, right? The second thing is money in politics. In fact, I wrote an article in a great little new journal called Modern American History about how Oliver North becomes, to me, a sort of a transitional figure between the sort of old right or sort of the Reaganite right and then the new right, partly because he shows how you can benefit from a scandal. He is caught up in a scandal and does as much as you possibly can to benefit from it, in that there's lying, there's blaming the press for reporting the truth. And then if the press continues to report the truth, you act like a martyr. And then you start making money from being a martyr. And so that gets intertwined with the new ways of raising money for politics, which is often mass mailing and finding sort of mass mailing lists. And so most of the people glom on to Oliver North, most people who control lists of say 50,000, 200,000, sometimes 20 million names, they glom on to the story of Oliver North as a victim of the Democrats, right? And all sorts of people are raising money off of his name, even though sometimes he doesn't want them to, right? But they're raising millions and millions of dollars. He also, in fact, in 1994, runs for the governorship of Virginia. And he wins the Republican nomination, but he loses to a Democrat by just a few points. But he's raising money from all sorts of, from I think all 50 states or something like 48 states that he raises money for Virginia, right? It's because he's a TV personality. And so he has sort of taken advantage of the new ways of raising money. And so as the laws over how you can insert money into politics get worse and worse in the 2000s, 2010s, there's more and more lying because of it.
Thank you.
I don't know who said it, but I am so struck by that quote, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I look at what's going on in the US now with absolute despair. And I just wonder if you've got a comment about the present situation, please.
I have many comments about the present situation, but actually, let me just sort of say what I say in the last chapter of the book, which is about the pardon, right? The George Bush pardon of this, is that the Republicans really do fail to learn about this. And in fact, if they've learned anything, it's hard to find evidence of them actually learning anything. But in the sort of mid-90s, some journalists go back to most of the Republicans who were sort of embroiled in this, and they say, you know, what's your memory of it now? What do you feel about it? Not one of them regrets having done what they've done. The only thing they're bitter about is that their government didn't protect them enough, right? Is that Reagan didn't protect them enough. Everybody protected Reagan, but the president didn't protect his own people, right? The CIA didn't protect their people. They basically said, you get sued, you're on your own. The CIA doesn't offer lawyers, right? So there's bitterness towards their own government, but not because it asked them to do anything wrong, just because it didn't protect them afterwards. So they've learned nothing, right? And they have no sense of guilt whatsoever about this. And I think for the Democrats, there's also very little sense that they've learned anything because nobody reflects back on this. It's just part of the Cold War, and let's forget about it, right? It's a Reagan scandal. That government's over. Let's move on. And so in that sense, the dictum is true that they keep on repeating this. And I mean, I wouldn't say that Trump has ever learned anything. Certainly hasn't read about Iran-Contra. I think if you asked him, he would have no idea, even though he was a grown man when it was happening. No, he doesn't read. I mean, that is an established fact. He can read, but he does not. People say, like, if you write more than 4 or 5 sentences, he won't read it. Maybe one page he'll read about something important, but he just does not read. He doesn't read. He's been asked over and over again about books, and he can't name one book he's ever read or anything about that book, right? So I don't think he's going to read mine. But I think if you asked him, you know, let's say he has a vague sense of what happened and he was honest about it, he'd probably say, what I learned about this is that if you do something bad for your president can pardon you, right? And the pardon becomes a way of protecting people politically, rather than a way for sort of society to move on or to give justice when justice maybe was denied before. And that's what the pardon used to be before the 1970s, I would say, was generally used pretty judiciously. I was talking to Tim about this earlier. I mean, it's almost a miracle to think for about 200 years, the pardon was actually used the way it was intended by the founding fathers. And really with sort of Watergate and beyond, it starts being used as a political tool for, if not directly for the president, at least for the White House in general.
Question here and then here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very, very fascinating talk. So 2 questions related. One, a lot of what you've described seems very familiar from what the CIA and the presidency were doing at the Afghan war in terms of third-party involvement, quid pro quo with third governments, taking private money, private arms dealers. So a lot of that is very, very familiar. The president misleading the Congress also. Do you feel that the only reason the media and the Congress even cared so much was because the weapons were going to Iran? So that's one part of it. And the second actually is related to the previous question. Don't you think the Republicans have learned too well from the scandal? Now they do this much, much better, much more effectively, flooding the zone, you know, having their own alternative media. Right. Being very blatant about not sharing documents, obstruction of justice. So one could argue that actually they've learned too well.
It's possible. I mean, it's hard to find evidence of Republicans thinking about Iran-Contra, or Democrats for that matter, right? Very few people go back and think about it at all. So
Exactly.
apart from scholars, but like politicians, they just don't think about it. So that's partly why I wrote this book, so that get people to think about it. For your question on Iran, I don't think Iran itself is that important in the scandal, right? It's sort of this mysterious black box that nobody seems to be able to kind of penetrate. I don't think they're that upset about it. I mean, the policy towards Iran is actually very clear. And so the illegality and just sort of the wrongheadedness of the policy is very clear. I mean, when the president starts talking about, well, we've got hostages that are clearly held in the Middle East and Iran can do something about it, and we can send them weapons, they want them, let's do it. Immediately, this is a meeting with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, right? George Bush is there, the Chief of Staff is there, all the bigwigs are there. They all say, Mr. President, do not do this, right? Because first of all, your policy is you don't negotiate with terrorists, right? And the American policy has long been you do not buy hostages back. Because what happens if you do that? Those hostages then have a value. And so the terrorists are more likely to take more hostages, right? And they've told all of their European allies, do not pay for hostages. Do not sell weapons to Iran, right? Because if anything, they've got a slight preference for Iraq, right? None of them are allies, but they'd rather have Iraq win than Iran. And so the president goes against all of this. It's just really bad policy on top of being illegal. In fact, he's told, we don't think this is legal, right? There's this particular act, and you're going to be violating this act if you do this. But let me say a larger point about the privatization of war. I'm actually working on another book right now that's more about this. What has happened since then is that the privatization of war, first of all, has gone nuclear, in the sense that these are like huge corporations, some of the biggest corporations in the world. Almost all governments use them. Often they become the vast majority of forces abroad. In Iran and Afghanistan, at some point, most of the American military personnel there were private, right? And so, but what this also means is that it's completely legal, right? So a lot of these folks, in this sense, were secretive. They didn't really have contracts with the government. It was all kind of hush-hush. And so if they were found out, you could indict them for all sorts of crimes. These days, these are major corporations. They've got legal contracts with the US government, but I would say the same dangers obtain, which is that they can profit way too much. And we've seen this. A lot of times it's no bid contract. We've seen that in Iraq. And also they can essentially control US foreign policy. Right? They can start a firefight somewhere. And then how do you try those soldiers? They're not employees of the US government, right? But if they kill Iraqi civilians with guns in their hands, paid for by the US government, it seems like you should be able to try them in a military court, but you can't because they're not soldiers. They're employees of a private, sometimes multinational corporation. There's all sorts of sort of ethical and legal questions that go along with privatizing war. Never mind the Russians and what's the name, Prigozhin or something like that? The one who sort of turned around in Ukraine and went back to try to have a coup against Putin, and then he got killed. So this is a problem that all governments have, that private corporations are taking way too much power in the conducting of war.
Roland has a question here. Thanks.
So much. That was fantastic. And I can remember the end of Iran-Contra as well, because there was Oliver North featured quite extensively in Mad Magazine, and I needed my parents to explain to me why this was funny. It's also how I learned about the dirty war in Argentina, though they gave me a very sanitized version of that, which I was grateful for. I was fascinated that in both cases, there's this slightly outsized place for very Baroque pieces of American technology, the Hawk and the TOW missiles, which Iran desperately needed because they were locked into the military infrastructure provided to the Shah, which they couldn't maintain and so forth. And then the withholding of the javelins in the case of Trump's first impeachment. I suppose one of my questions is about perhaps so the specifics of modern armaments and sort of modern technology and so forth perhaps affords these kind of different opportunities and almost amplifies the power of the executive branch to sort of abuse the authorities it has in foreign policy, because you don't need to be raising huge armies and so forth. You just need to say, well, give them some spares, withhold spares here and there. It's sort of almost like diamonds or other jewels are kind of uniquely lootable. It's almost like the same dynamic here, that they're kind of a very special commodity, which affords a very special kind of concentrated power of themselves, perhaps.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the size of the American military at the time affords it this sort of the ability to hide these weapons exchanges and then deniability. I mean, most of the weapons, I would say maybe half of the weapons or the missiles that are sold to Iran, they're actually not sold directly. The original Iran scheme is for Israel, of all countries, right? Israel to sell weapons to Iran, and then the United States gives Israel, replenishes those weapons. So when the scandal first erupts, Reagan goes on television, and this is the first image I had where he's just like confused like this. They ask him all these questions, and he says, we actually never negotiated with the Iranians for hostages. We never sold the Iranians weapons for hostages. And in the first year or so, that's actually true. The Iranians are buying from the Israelis, right? And the Israelis are getting those weapons back from the United States. And then maybe there's a hostage that's liberated. It's only because the United States has so many weapons, it's selling so many weapons to so many countries that it can easily move a few thousand of them and nobody really notices, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure they even make much of a difference in the Iran-Iraq war. And so that's, and then it's also sort of a confusing chain of command as to how you get those weapons. Sometimes the weapons are sent through the CIA. Even the CIA should absolutely not be doing this. It's also illegal. Sometimes the CIA is sort of asking Department of Defense for those weapons, and then they're sending it. So it's not the Defense Department that's doing it. And so they try to get around the law by doing it that way. So it's not, these are not Department of Defense weapons. So because the apparatus of war and secrecy is so big, you can sort of hide these pretty big transactions, right? Thousands of missiles that are worth, several $1 million.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. Did you have one?
Chris, are there any questions on the
Yeah,
chat?
we just got 2 questions online. Prudence asks, could you expand on the impact of Watergate, both on the behavior and actions of the Reagan White House and in how congressional Republicans behaved? And also, could we view Nixon's resignation in the role of Senate Republicans as an abnegation of democratic norms and evasion of justice?
Okay, the first one is about congressional Republicans and their behavior. But what is the question specifically?
Sorry, the question was, well, could you expand on the impact of Watergate in this?
Of
and the
Watergate,
behavior?
okay. Yes. Now, Watergate is a fascinating prequel to this. And I didn't talk about it, but it is very important, sort of creating a mindset for all the players here. And so is Vietnam, by the way. But Watergate is the political prequel to this, in that in Watergate, you have a president who has clearly done wrong, but mostly he's done wrong in covering up what others have done wrong for him, right? He doesn't actually commit the crimes, he just covers it up. As I say, the cover-up is worse than the crime. What happens politically is that the American people essentially get vengeance against the Republicans by voting in lots of Democrats, not only in the presidency, but especially in Congress. And then there's a wave of legislation that comes out of Democratic, and there's a lot of the Democrats are very progressive, more than they were in the 50s or 60s. A lot of them are sort of anti-war, civil rights, veterans. And so they are passing laws that make it harder for the president to go to war, and make it easier for Congress to have oversight over the operations of all kinds, CIA operations, that sort of thing. So a lot of the oversight of Congress is very new. By the early 80s, it's just really 10 years old that they've had to sort of report so much to congressional intelligence committees. And that's why people like Bill Casey, who didn't grow up like this, they hate this state of affairs. Why do we need to tell, people, members of Congress, especially Democrats, what we're going to do, right? Well, we've always hidden it from the Congress, and now, there's been some laws that are congressional, that are constitutional, but otherwise, you can interpret these laws. So that's traumatic to a lot of Republicans. And there's also, of course, the trauma of losing a presidency over a scandal, right? That has just happened also, and they're very, very angry about that, and they're very scared of it happening again. And of course, not just losing the presidency, but losing the Congress, right? We tend to forget that throughout most of the 70s and 80s, Democrats have control of Congress, right? And so so these Republican presidents are always facing a Democratic Congress, and they have to sort of learn to deal with them. And that's not essentially the reality we've had for the past 20 years or so. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that. Was there another question?
Yeah, there's one more question. This one was from Alan. Do you see the Iran-Contra affair as an anomaly or just typical of US foreign policy and domestic politics over the last 150 years?
Typical?
Yeah.
Typical or is it an anomaly?
No, I mean, certain parts of it are typical.
I mean, I think some of us have a cynical perspective today with
Yeah,
current
yeah.
events. So
I mean, obviously, I'm sort of making the case that this is sort of typical, or at least it's an acceleration of things that are already happening. Some of the most frightening comments are people back then in the 80s who, once the panoply of crimes are uncovered, and, you know, for instance, Oliver North is indicted for like 16 different charges, right? And then you've got commentators, you know, lawyers and aides on Capitol Hill saying, oh, he lied to Congress, he altered some documents, he shredded some documents. It's like, I can think of 100 people on Capitol Hill who've done the same thing. Why are you focusing on this guy? I mean, that's the really frightening thing about this, right, is that he gets caught, right? And of course, when he gets caught, he knows he's done some things that even he as a Christian considers sinful, but he doesn't consider that any of it is illegal or even unusual. Right? He just said, of course I lied, and my God tells me I shouldn't lie, but my president tells me I should, so I lied, you know, but I shouldn't go to prison for it. So I actually don't see Oliver North as particularly indicative of a sinful person, right? Or sort of I mean, he's actually relatively truthful when he's put in front of Congress. And I think he also doesn't have any sort of ulterior motives. He's not trying to make money off of this. He's not trying to become very popular. He just really wants these policies to work. And he's a patriot. He's a war hero. He's a patriot. He works very, very hard. He lies a whole lot, you know, and he's certainly at the middle of all this. But he's sort of caught up in this ideology that as a maker of foreign policy in the White House, you should be able to do anything you want as long as the president has given you a general direction in which to go, and you're going in that direction. And laws and values are not part of it, because ultimately you're trying to do something good in the world. And I believe that he truly believes that.
I think we're out of time now. Oh, final question, Margaret.
This will be the very shortest question.
Yeah.
Of all the keywords, the keyword was delusional. And my head nearly exploded. In amongst this highfalutin, hootin'-tootin', you know, male-oriented world, where does the reciprocity, you know, back and forward between one another, where does that slide across that line? And I think we need to think about that at the moment. Thank you. I love the lecture.
I'm going to give you the last word on that. I think that's exactly true. Yeah. I mean, let me say just fundamentally, truth really is the most important value and norm of democracy, right? I mean, I'm not the first to say this, but if you stop, you know, we saw this in the firing of the BLS commissioner last week by Trump. A lot of people commented, rightly so, that if the government stops creating any truth, any statistics that you can count on, for instance, right, among many other truths, then if you can't, you know, truth is the shared truth is the only way that one political actor can get another political actor to help them do something, is by persuading them. If you don't have a shared vision of the truth, you can't persuade anyone of anything. So how do you get them to do what you want them to do? Through force. And that's how lack of truth leads to authoritarianism. Yes. Thank you for the question.
Certainly a very sobering tale that you tell. And, you know, Reagan was often called the Teflon president, wasn't he? That you couldn't get anything to stick on him. And I think you've sort of taken that to another level with what you've shown us today. So thank you for a fascinating lecture. Thank you for everyone for coming. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.